Okay, so we talked about what colloid was. It's in the thyroid, the gelatinous fluid filling the follicle, composed of this thyroglobulin protein. It's used as a precursor to thyroid hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, what's the big deal about it? Well, it binds to receptors on follicle cells. It stimulates them to transport iodine into the follicle cells. Follicle cells are the only cells in the body that can transport iodine. They have sodium iodine transporter in them, and so iodine can be brought into the cell. And then iodine atoms are then oxidized, and then those iodine atoms are then spit back out of the cell into the colloid mixture, and those iodine atoms are then added to the thyroglobulin, and it's added to the tyrosine amino acids in the thyroglobulin. There's about 100 or so tyrosine amino acids in the like 2,700 or so amino acids that are in thyroglobulin. So they get added to a whole bunch of those tyrosine molecules, tyrosine amino acids that are this long chain of the thyroglobulin, and then there's two different tyrosine molecules will come together and cross-link, and then upon continued stimulation by thyroid stimulating hormone, that whole complex gets brought into the follicle cell, and that tyrosine complex, those two tyrosines brought together, get broken off, cleaved off, and then that gets secreted by the cell, and that goes into the bloodstream. And then the rest of the thyroglobulin that wasn't used gets broken down, and those parts get reused to make more thyroglobulin, which gets pumped back out into the colloid. So it's like this cycle that's going on inside the cell. Inside the cell, outside the cell, and into the bloodstream. We'll talk about what happens. But there's the two types of thyroid hormones that you get. There's triiodothyronine and thyroxine. And so sometimes you have 3 iodine atoms, and that's spelled wrong. There's no E there. So you have 3 iodine atoms, that's triiodothyronine, and then you can have 4 iodine atoms, tetraiodothyronine, or thyroxine is what it's called. So you have T3 or you have T4 that's made. That's transported out of the follicle cells and into the bloodstream. So that's what the follicle cells in the thyroid do. Parafollicular cells, they secrete calcitonin, and that decreases blood calcium levels. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's and it actually works in opposition to another mechanism. So, but it decreases blood calcium levels if blood calcium levels get too high. So, all right, next slide. So here's the diagram of what all happens. I know this looks really complicated. You're not going to have to reproduce this. I just wanted to show you this because these are the only cells that do this kind of thing. So you have iodine come in. So you have iodine, and it comes into the cell, and then it gets sent out of the cell, and it gets oxidized out here. And so you lose a negative charge, and then you iodinate this protein here, and this protein is thyroglobulin. So you add iodines to it, and that's what all these little balls are right there, and there, and there, and there. Those are all iodines that have been added to tyrosine. Thyroglobulin was made up here from the endoplasmic reticulum, and then it was built and brought up, and then excreted by exocytosis. So you have this thyroglobulin molecule out here that has no iodines on it, and then it gets iodinated. So it gets iodinated. It's an A. And then, so after it's iodinated down here, then the cell takes it back up through endocytosis, and then the protein is cut into little pieces, and thyroxine and triiodothyronine are sent out into the bloodstream. So that's how the whole process works. So it's kind of amazing people put all this stuff together. I think it's really, really fascinating. Anyway, all right, next slide. So Here's thyroid gland cross-section. Here's a thyroid follicle, the whole thing here. Okay, and you can see the cells, the follicle cells lining the outside of it. You see all the little dots, those are all the little nuclei. So that's the follicular epithelium of those of follicle. And this is, so here's a big one here, I'll write it here. This is colloid, containing the thyroglobulin. Okay, next slide. Here's a higher magnification view, and we have the follicular epithelium here. So we have the follicle cells lining all the way around the outside here. Colloid, and then we have the parafollicular cells. That's what all these cells, here's a couple they've pointed to here. All these cells here are all parafollicular cells, that whole group of them there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have on this slide we're talking about a negative feedback loop with thyroxine and or triiodothyronine. So you have, that's T3, and this is T4. So what happens is, if T3 and T4, depending on the concentration of blood, let's say the concentration drops, so they went low, this tells the hypothalamus is going to sense this and decide to release thyrotropin releasing hormone. So so that's released, and that goes down and hits the anterior pituitary, which then releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which comes down and acts on the thyroid. And the thyroid, the follicular cells in the thyroid, then start producing thyroglobulin and iodinating it and putting iodine on it and creating T3, triiodothyronine, and T4, thyroxine, or tetraiodothyronine. Those two things, those two thyroid hormones, then the effects of them on the body are they increase, basically just increase basal metabolic rate of body cells. Also, you get a rise in body temperature. So then, as that occurs, and the elevated levels of T3 and T4 have occurred, you start having negative feedback on the original stimulus. So the T3 and T4, the hypothalamus senses that and says, "Oh, there's high levels of T3, T4 in the blood, so I don't need to. We don't need to make any more of that. We got plenty, so I'm going to stop releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone." And then the anterior pituitary says, "Oh, I'm not getting a signal from thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, to make TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, so I'm going to stop releasing that." So then you've raised the level, and then the high level told you to shut off the process. So that's a negative feedback loop there. So that's how that all works. All right, next slide. Okay, so we have the parathyroid. This is little glands that are on the back side of the thyroid gland. So here's the parathyroid here, and you got these parathyroid glands. There's 4 of them on the posterior side of the thyroid. So you have the trachea here, and you notice this is hyaline cartilage here that's in the trachea. And notice it doesn't go all the way around the trachea. It actually makes a C all the way, almost all the way. It doesn't meet all the way, but it goes most of the way. And so they've drawn this picture correctly, which is nice. And then the esophagus is here, and so that's posterior to the trachea. And so then you have the parathyroid glands. So what are the parathyroid glands all about? Well, they contain a cell called a chief cell, and it secretes something called parathyroid hormone, and that stimulates osteoclasts to break down bone. And what happens when you break down bone? You release calcium into the bloodstream. So, and parathyroid hormone also stimulates reabsorption of calcium from the filtrate in the kidneys and absorption of calcium from food in the bloodstream. So, chief cells secrete the parathyroid hormone, so PTH, and that causes osteoclasts to chew up bone and release calcium. So calcium goes up. Now, in opposition of the parathyroid cells, there are the parafollicular cells of the thyroid, and those inhibit osteoclast activity when blood calcium rises too much. So parafollicular cells, those guys, they secrete calcitonin, and that causes calcium levels to go down. So that's your opposition thing. So you have the The chief cells of the parathyroid releasing parathyroid hormone causing calcium levels to go up, and the parafollicular cells releasing calcitonin tell calcium to go down. So those two things are in opposition to each other. The chief cells are here in the parafollicular or the parathyroid region of the parathyroid gland. And I know this is confusing with the parafollicular cells and the parathyroid gland. So parathyroid, para meaning around, or so you have the gland is around the thyroid. Parafollicular cells is around the follicular cells. So that's how you can remember those. So parafollicular cells are around the follicles, and parathyroid is around the thyroid. So parathyroid cells do the PTH, and the parafollicular cells do the calcitonin. And then also we have a second type of cell in the parathyroid. These are called oxyphil cells, and we actually don't know what those do. They're in there, but we really don't know what the function is of them. All right, next slide. So here's the parathyroid and thyroid glands in cross section. And with thyroid gland, and you can see here's a follicle, here's a follicle, and here's a follicle. There's big ones and little ones. They're not all the same size. I circled a few of the follicles there. So those are colloid, surrounded by follicular or follicle cells. Here's another one in the middle. It's a nice big one there. So, and there's another one right there. So, yeah, now you can start seeing all of them through there. Then we have the parathyroid gland, which is down here. I'll draw a circle all the way around it, although you can't see the part of the circle I drew. So we have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid. And there's two separate things. The thyroid gland has the follicles with a colloid in the middle, that thyroglobulin protein filling up all those little balls. And they have the parathyroid gland, which is a small structure on the back side, the posterior side of the thyroid gland. You have 4 of those. All right, next slide. Here's a higher magnification view of parathyroid and thyroid glands. Here's the thyroid gland. This has the follicles. There's one there. Here's one here. Here's one here. So you can see you can easily see them now. And here's the parathyroid gland, and you see the whole thing here. And it's composed of chief cells and oxyphil cells. On the next slide, we'll see those. So here's the chief cells. Those are smaller cells, not as much cytoplasm around them. They're closely crowded together. And they have the oxyphil cells over here. And you can see those are larger cells. Here's like, you can see that. And there's one here. I'm just circling a few of these just so you can, that have well-defined cell membranes around them. So they look less dense. It looks like there's fewer, and there are fewer nuclei in a mass of oxyphil cells than you'll have a mass of chief cells. The chief cells are just all closer together. All right, and the chief cells are all glandular cells, so they're producing something secreting this, and then it leaves the parathyroid. All right, next slide. I just want to put this slide here just to show you that you have chief cells and oxyphil cells, but they're not always separated into 2 groups. They're intermingled. So here's an oxyphil cell here. Here's another one here. You can see that cell membrane on it. And then you have all these chief cells here. Here's one. All these little dots on the nuclei through there. You can see all the chief cells. Those are producing the parathyroid hormone, making PTH. So, all right, next slide. Okay, since we're talking about the thyroid gland, we need to talk about a few things. There's 3 things: iodine deficiency, hypothyroidism, and hyperthyroidism. So first we'll talk about iodine deficiency. In 1924, the U.S. decided to start putting iodine in salt. So you fortified salt with iodine. So now you can buy iodized salt. You can buy that at the grocery store. And you have been able to for a long time. There wasn't enough iodine in the diet in a lot of cases in the States or elsewhere in the world. If you're inland, you're far away from seafood. Fish have living in the ocean, and they take in salt, and so they have decent levels of iodine in them. And so if you eat seafood, then you can get iodine. But if you're inland, you don't have access to seafood, or at least like when I was growing up, you didn't have that much access to seafood. It was a real treat to go to Florida and actually get actual fish from the ocean. So now it's real easy to do. You go to the grocery store and get that easily now. So iodine deficiency isn't a big deal in the United States anymore. But the reason you need iodine, we talked about this, is you cannot produce T3 or T4 if you don't have iodine. You have to iodize the thyroglobulin, those tyrosine residues, those tyrosine amino acids. That's what we used to call them, residues. The tyrosine amino acids that are in that long chain of amino acids and thyroglobulin, you have to put iodine on every single one of those, or not every one, but several of them, to create triiodothyronine and thyroxine. So if you don't have iodine, you can't make these thyroid hormones. So what happens is that you get thyroid stimulating hormone keeps being produced by the pituitary. Thyrotropin releasing hormone keeps acting on the pituitary, saying, hey, thyroid hormone levels are down. We've got to be able to make more. That must be what it is. And so the pituitary sends a signal down to the thyroid, say, hey, produce more T3, T4. And the follicle cells are like, hey, we're trying to do it. We're making thyroglobulin, but we don't have any iodine to put on here. But the hypothalamus and the pituitary don't listen to that. So what happens is the follicle cells keep getting stimulated to make T3 and T4. They can't. So all they can do is make thyroglobulin. So those follicles start filling up with thyroglobulin. They get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what happens? So you have all those follicles are all getting bigger. And so you end up with a situation that's called goiter, and you have a swelling. The thyroid swells, and so you have this large mass that shows there. That's not as big a deal as other more severe iodine deficiency disorders, because you can result in impairments in growth, development. You have decreased fertility, even prenatal and infant death. It's also the primary cause of preventable impairments in mental development worldwide. One form is called cretinism, also referred to as neonatal hypothyroidism. Is characterized by you have cognitive defects, short stature, sometimes deafness and muteness in children and adults who were born to mothers who were iodine deficient during pregnancy. Then the next thing is hypothyroidism. So this occurs if you have sufficient iodine, but for some reason the thyroid isn't making enough T3 and T4. So that's hypothyroidism, means you don't have enough T3 and T4 in the blood. So that's an inflammation of the thyroid. So you have low levels of thyroid hormone being produced. Symptoms include weight gain, low metabolic rate. You have your extremities are cold. You have constipation, reduced libido, menstrual irregularities, and even reduced mental activity would be some of the symptoms of hypothyroidism. Next slide. Then you have hyperthyroidism. This could be due to a thyroid tumor, or another explanation would be example would be Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disorder where follicle cells are overstimulated, and so that overstimulation, then those follicle cells are making lots of thyroglobulin, so those follicles can get big, and so you can have goiter with hypothyroidism as well as with iodine deficiency. So some of the symptoms, and here's on the left side is a picture of a goiter. So that's the swollen thyroid gland there. You can see how large that got. And the Graves' disease, so hyperthyroidism, where you're making a lot of thyroid hormone, you might be sweating, headache, weight loss, nervousness, emotional instability, tremors, exophthalmos, bulging eyes. You might have goiter. Arrhythmia and tachycardia, you might have a fast heartbeat. That's what tachycardia is a higher heartbeat rate than normal. You might also have irregular menstrual cycles, and you also might have muscle soreness as well. So, all right, next slide. That's Graves' disease. Next slide. Okay, now on to the thymus. And the thymus produces thymosin and thymopoietin, which stimulates the maturation of T lymphocytes, which is a type of white blood cell. So T cells they're also called killer cells. They go and kill invading things, invade your body. This gland is large in children, shrinks after puberty. It's mostly adipose and connective tissue in adults. And here it is on this drawing. So this is your thymus gland here. There, it's right, right around the heart, laying anterior to the aorta, and right next to the heart, and in between the lungs, and so anterior to the trachea and all that. All right, next slide. Okay, and here's a diagram of the thymus gland. You can see it sitting there between the lungs, on top of the heart, and in front of the trachea. So it's anterior to the trachea, it's medial to the lungs, and it's slightly superior to the heart. And so we have a right lobe and a left lobe there, and you have these lobules. So there's the thymus gland making hormones for maturation of T lymphocytes. Next slide. The adrenal glands, here's a dissection of a cadaver. And so here's a kidney, here to here, and here's another kidney on this side. So the left kidney there. So here's your left adrenal gland here, and here's your right adrenal gland here. So that's where they are, sitting on top of the kidneys, kind of like a little hat sitting on top of the kidney. All right, next slide. Okay, the adrenal glands. We have the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, the outside and the inside. So the cortex is outside layer, and the medulla is the internal part. So, we have the kidney. We talked about, we showed the cadaver a second ago. So here's the kidney, and here's your adrenal gland sitting. So you got your kidney and a little hat sitting on top. So here's your adrenal cortex. It's a cross section through the kidney, and here's your adrenal medulla. So here's your cortex, is this region here, and then this inside that is all. That's all the medulla. So that's medulla, and this is the cortex. That's adrenal. Okay, so the adrenal cortex is divided into three parts. So we have the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. So, how do you remember these things? Well, you have one way you can do it is, well, let me point out what these are first. So, the adrenal cortex is the place where you make hormones from cholesterol. So the zona glomerulosa, you make mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. That's important for salt, electrolyte, and water balance. Stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb reabsorb sodium. And so kidneys reabsorb sodium, and water is going to follow by osmosis. It goes, well, there's more salt over here, so I have too much water here and not as much water over here, so they're out of balance, so I bring more water in. So water goes by osmosis back into the body. And so that's the way you can use something like aldosterone to increase blood volume and blood pressure, and or you can decrease urine volume also. Zona fasciculata meaning little bundle. You make glucocorticoids like cortisol and androgenic steroids. Cortisol stimulates gluconeogenesis in the liver, and breakdown of muscle to release amino acids, and breakdown of lipids to release fatty acids. The zona reticularis also makes glucocorticoids and androgenic steroids. So the fasciculata and the reticularis, both of those make the glucocorticoids and androgenic steroids. So the reticularis is this layer here. So draw just a little part of it here. That's reticularis layer there. So that's what that line is there. And then we have the zona fasciculata is this middle part here, and the zona glomerulosa is this outer layer out here. So this part here. Okay. All right, and let's see. And so one way you can remember this, I guess I should mention this. The way you can remember this is, so you have medulla is on the inside. The zona reticularis is the next one. And then we have the fasciculata and the glomerulosa. So you have Mr. FG. Does that help? If that helps you with your remembering these layers. So medulla, then you have the cortex is the RFG part. Reticularis, fasciculata, and glomerulosa. Next slide. So we have the cortex and medulla. So the adrenal medulla also makes hormones as well. And it has these cells called chromaffin cells. And they produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which increase heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and increased digestion. Those are also called, adrenaline. Okay, so for adrenal, so you have adrenal. So you have adrenaline and noradrenaline. You can call it anything, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, and there's the structures of both of those, epinephrine and norepinephrine there. Okay, and the only difference is everything's the same except for this is an amino group here, and this ends up with a H and a carbon over here. So, or it'd be a CH3 on there. So, anyway, next slide. So if you have epinephrine and you have an EpiPen and you have allergic reactions, this is what you would use. So this has epinephrine in it, so you can inject yourself very easily with this. If you're allergic to, say, bee stings, you can use this, and this will help save you from a severe allergic reaction. Next slide. So here's a frontal section of the kidney and adrenal gland. And I just wanted to point out, this is that also the kidney also has a cortex and a medulla. So, but just so you remember, we're only talking about the adrenal gland here. We're not talking much about the kidney at all. We're talking about the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland has a cortex and medulla. And so you have the medulla, then reticularis, and fasciculata and glomerulosa layers of the cortex and the adrenal gland. You'll learn more about the kidney, I think, in AP2 when you talk about the urinary system. Next slide. So here we go. So here's the adrenal cortex and what it looks like. Here's a diagram on the left, and then an actual photomicrograph on the right. So and here's a little mnemonic down here, Mr. FG. So we have the medulla here, adrenal medulla, and Mr. Zona reticularis, zona fasciculata, and zona glomerulosa, and then we have what's called a capsule on the outside. So this is glomerulosa here. This is fasciculata here. This is reticularis here, and this is the medulla down here. And so you can see the difference in cells here. You can see the zona glomerulosa here, fasciculata here, reticularis is here, and you can't see behind my head, but you can look it up on the PowerPoint and you can see what that looks like. But you can see there's different layers of cells in the adrenal cortex, and then the medulla has a lot of chromaffin cells making adrenaline, noradrenaline. Next slide. So here's adrenal gland cross section. You have the medulla in the middle, and you have the cortex is this whole bit through here. So, and you can actually start picking out, here's your capsule. And so you have reticularis and fasciculata and glomerulosa. So that's up here, through there, and then that and that. So you have your R, F, and some layer there, G. So next slide. So it's much easier to see in this one. So you have the medulla here in the middle. So here's your medulla. Here, oops, a little far there. Sorry about that. And this would be, so there's medulla. Then here's your reticularis. Here's your fasciculata, and your glomerulosa is there. So R, F, G. All right, next slide. And here's a higher magnification of same thing. So you have reticularis, fasciculata, and glomerulosa there. So reticularis, fasciculata, and glomerulosa, and the medulla in the center here. There. And the capsule around the outside. All right, next slide. And even higher magnification, just showing the thing. And you see the fasciculata, these cells are arranged sort of like in kind of stacked on it, almost in columns going up. And so, and similar to there's some portion of reticularis looks that way too, but they kind of like line up and go up. And you'll have another row, another column of them going up like that towards the outside. So, and then the glomerulosa is a little more not structured that way. So, all right, next slide.